The sea after midnight carries a particular kind of silence, the kind that settles into your bones if you let it. In the small coastal town of Harborview, where the salt air drifts off the water and clings to everything it touches, that silence had a habit of arriving right around the hour, when most people had already surrendered to sleep. But in the narrow kitchen of a restaurant called Blue Harbor, a man named Ethan Cole had not yet surrendered to anything. He stood at the stove in a worn gray apron, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hands moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 1,000 nights in exactly this position. A cast-iron pot sat over a low flame. Inside it, a seafood chowder had been simmering for nearly an hour, the broth deepened with cream and white wine, studded with clams and shrimp and cubes of potato, the whole thing fragrant with thyme and the ghost of garlic. Across the kitchen, on a wooden chair pushed up against the wall, his 7-year-old daughter Lily had fallen asleep with her small head tilted sideways. Her dark hair fanned across her shoulder, her hands still loosely curled around a crayon drawing she had been working on before sleep claimed her. Ethan glanced at her every few minutes, the way parents do that private, involuntary checking. A reflex older than thought. He turned down the flame, ladled a small portion of soup into a bowl, set it aside to cool, and stood for a moment, just listening to the sound of the water outside. Ethan Cole was 38 years old. He was not a tall man, but he was solid broad through the shoulders, with hands that showed the marks of real work. A small scar at the base of his left thumb from a knife that had slipped years ago, the faint discoloration along his knuckles from hot pans and open flame. He had dark eyes and a quiet face. The kind of face that didn't announce itself in a room but that people found themselves looking at twice when they passed. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck, the color of weathered slate. He wore jeans and plain shirts. He owned 2 pairs of shoes. His apartment above the restaurant was small, 1 bedroom for Lily. A pull-out couch for himself, a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people to stand in side by side, but it was clean and it was warm, and it smelled, always, of whatever he had been cooking. The town of Harborview had grown up around him over the past 4 years. Or rather, he had grown into it, learned its rhythms, its regulars, its particular light in the afternoon, when the sun came off the water at an angle that turned everything briefly gold. He had chosen it deliberately, this small place, this quiet life. Every morning he walked Lily to school 6 blocks away, holding her hand at the crosswalk, sometimes stopping at the bakery on the corner for 2 croissants, wrapped in wax paper that they ate while walking. Every evening he was back in the kitchen of Blue Harbor before 5, working the line beside a small crew of 3, Marcus on the grill, Jenny on appetizers, old Pete who washed dishes, and occasionally offered unsolicited opinions about the weather. The staff adored him with the particular loyalty that people reserve for bosses who treat them like human beings. He remembered birthdays. He covered shifts when someone's child was sick. He never raised his voice in the kitchen, even on the worst nights when the orders backed up and the printer ran hot and everything seemed to be happening at once. He simply moved faster, got quieter, and somehow it all came together. Lily was everything. She was the organizing principle around which his entire life arranged itself. The reason the alarm went off at 6:15, the reason the soup was always cooling on the counter when she woke, the reason he had stayed in Harborview when another opportunity had presented itself 2 years ago, a better-paying job in a city 200 miles north. He had turned it down without regret. Lily was in 2nd grade. She had made friends. She loved the beach. He was not willing to uproot her for a salary. His daughter moved through the world with an openness that humbled him. She collected shells on the weekends and kept them in a jar on the windowsill, assigned them names, invented elaborate histories for each one. She had her mother's cheekbones and Ethan's stubborn patience. Her mother had been gone since Lily was 2, a departure that had not been dramatic, no argument, no betrayal, simply a woman who had realized, quietly and with genuine sorrow, that she was not built for the life she had chosen, and who had left to find the one she was. Ethan had not blamed her for this. He had raised Lily alone since then, and in doing so had discovered that he was far more capable of love than he had ever known. Vanessa had come into his life 18 months ago. She was 30 years old. With dark hair she wore long and straight, a face that stopped conversations, and a particular talent for wearing colors that other people could not have pulled off. She worked at the boutique hotel 2 blocks from the waterfront, handling events and private bookings, a job that gave her access to a certain stratum of life, the caterers and florists and well-dressed strangers who moved through Harborview's summer season and then evaporated back to wherever they came from. She had walked into Blue Harbor on a Tuesday evening in early spring, alone, and ordered the pan-seared halibut with lemon beurre blanc. Ethan had sent it out with a small ramekin of herb oil on the side, unprompted, because he had noticed the halibut that morning and known it would benefit from something acid and bright. She had left a comment with Jenny that the food was unlike anything she'd had in the town, and the next Tuesday she was back, and the Tuesday after that. By summer they were together. She was, in the early months, genuinely sweet curious about Lily, attentive in the way that people who want to be loved are attentive, easy to make laugh. And Ethan, who had been alone for so long that solitude had become invisible to him, found himself grateful for her warmth, her perfume, the particular way she pressed her cheek against his shoulder when they stood at the water's edge. But Vanessa had grown up watching a version of success that was measured in square footage and name brands, and somewhere in the architecture of her wanting, there was a room that Ethan's life could never fill. She owned things he didn't: nicer clothes, a newer car, a membership to a gym across town, and she was beginning, quietly at first, and then less quietly, to feel the friction between what she had and what she wanted. One evening, standing in his apartment while Lily slept and Ethan was washing dishes, she looked around at the small rooms, the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, the second-hand bookshelf, the single window overlooking the alley, and she exhaled slowly through her nose, a sound just barely audible, but unmistakable in its meaning. 2 weeks later, in the golden first week of October, a convoy of black luxury cars pulled up in front of Blue Harbor and paused at the curb, and Vanessa, standing near the window with a glass of wine, watched them arrive and felt something shift in the center of her chest like a compass needle finding north. The man who stepped out of the lead car was Adrian Sterling. He was 45, silver-templed, with the kind of posture that comes from decades of rooms full of people who want something from you. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who had never stood in a line in his life. Adrian had made his money in commercial real estate. He owned 3 buildings in the city, 40 miles north of Harborview, a portfolio of vacation properties along the coast, and a reputation in certain circles as a man of impeccable taste and selective generosity. He came to Harborview twice a year, usually in the fall and again in late spring, to visit the property he owned on the North Shore, a cedar-shingled house on a private stretch of beach that he used occasionally, and rented out the rest of the year at rates that made people flinch. He had discovered Blue Harbor 3 years earlier and had made a habit, each visit, of dining there on his first and last evenings. He always requested a table by the window. He always ordered whatever Ethan had marked as the evening's special, and he always, without exception, left a note, not a review, not a star rating, but an actual handwritten note on the restaurant's small comment cards that said something brief and specific about the food. Once it had read, "The stock in that bisque was made with someone's whole attention." Another time, "I've eaten at 12 Michelin-starred restaurants this year. Tonight was better than 10 of them." Ethan had found these notes in the hostess folder when closing, and had read them with the private satisfaction of a craftsman who has been correctly understood. Adrian took his usual table. Jenny came to greet him, and he was charming with her, in the practiced way of someone who has learned that kindness to staff is a form of self-interest. He ordered the evening special, a slow-roasted branzino over fennel and saffron, and a bottle of white burgundy. Vanessa, who had been at the bar finishing her glass of wine while Ethan worked, found herself drawn into conversation when Adrian commented on the painting above the bar, a small seascape by a local artist, with enough genuine knowledge of light and composition to signal that his appreciation was not performance. By the end of the evening they had exchanged names and a brief, open-ended pleasantry about the town. Adrian's eyes had stayed on her a moment too long when he stood to leave. Vanessa had noticed. She went home that night and lay awake thinking about the quality of his shoes. Over the following 2 weeks, Adrian extended his visit, something he claimed was due to ongoing negotiations with a contractor on the North Shore property, though the contractor later recalled no particular urgency to the work. He returned to Blue Harbor 3 more times. Each time, he found a reason to speak to Vanessa. He mentioned a gallery opening in the city. He mentioned a dinner he was hosting the following weekend on the yacht he kept moored at the marina. He mentioned these things, the way people mention things when they mean something else entirely. He sent a small bouquet of white flowers to the boutique hotel, addressed to her. He left, on his 3rd visit, a thin velvet box on the bar beside her, glass inside it. A bracelet, gold, with a single pavé clasp. The note said only, "A token from someone who recognizes quality." Vanessa held the bracelet in her hand for a long time after he left, turning it in the light. That same evening, in the kitchen behind the closed pass-through door, Ethan was teaching a new line cook how to properly deglaze a pan, his voice low and patient, the flame high, the cognac catching and releasing its brief blue fire. He didn't know about the bracelet. He didn't know a great deal of things that were happening on the other side of that door. But the distance between them, which had been growing for months in the way of things that grow in the dark, had now acquired a direction. The end, when it came, arrived on a night in November when the rain had been falling since afternoon, a cold, sideways rain that came in off the water and made the streets of Harborview look like a painting of themselves. Ethan had worked a double that day, covering for Marcus, who had called in sick, and he had come home after 11 smelling of garlic and rendered butter, his feet aching, his hands red from the cold water of the sink. Vanessa was sitting in the apartment when he arrived, not on the couch, where she usually waited, but at the small table, her coat already on, her bag in her lap. This was the posture of departure. He recognized it without wanting to. He set his keys on the counter and looked at her, and she looked back, and for a moment neither of them said anything. And in that silence, everything that had been accumulating between them every evening, she had stared at his apartment and found it wanting. Every dinner where he had talked about Lily's school, and she had listened, without quite listening. Every morning she had woken beside him and felt the particular ache of a life that was not the one she wanted. All of it was present in the room with them, dense and patient, waiting. She said she needed more. She said she had been trying for a long time to be content with what they had, and she wasn't, and she was sorry. But she couldn't keep pretending otherwise. She said, and this was the sentence that would stay with him: "Love can't pay bills, Ethan." Her voice wasn't cruel when she said it. It was tired, which was, in some ways, worse. He stood by the kitchen counter with his coat still on, and he listened to her without interrupting. And when she had finished, he was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then he said, very calmly, "I hope you find what you're looking for." She waited, perhaps, for something more, an argument, a revelation, a reason to reconsider. He gave her none of these things. He simply stepped aside from the doorway. She picked up her bag. The door closed behind her, with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. From the bedroom doorway, Lily stood in her pajamas, her small face confused and very still, holding the corner of a stuffed rabbit against her cheek. She had heard. Children always hear. Ethan crossed the room in 4 steps and picked her up and carried her back to bed. And he sat with her in the dark until her breathing evened out into sleep. And then he sat there a while longer, in the dark, not thinking about anything in particular, just listening to the rain against the window and the far-off sound of the waves and the particular quality. The following morning, he made pancakes with blueberries from the freezer and cut them into the shapes of stars, because Lily had asked him once if breakfast could be more like an adventure, and she had not forgotten, and neither had he. He drove her to school. He stopped at the bakery. He watched her walk through the gate and wave once without looking back, the way children do when they are already thinking about what comes next. He returned to his truck and sat for a moment with the engine off. Then his phone rang, and the area code was 212, which was Manhattan, and when he picked up, the voice on the other end belonged to a man named Gerald Whitmore, who was the senior partner of a firm called Whitmore and Associates, and who said, with the careful cadence of a man delivering significant information. "Mr. Cole, I'm calling about your father." The office of Whitmore and Associates occupied the 34th floor of a building on Park Avenue, and from its windows the city spread out in every direction with the indifference of a thing that has seen too much to be moved by any particular arrival. Ethan sat across from Gerald Whitmore in a chair that was extremely expensive, without advertising the fact, the kind of furniture that tells you something about money through what it doesn't say. Gerald was 70, precise in his movements, with white hair and frameless glasses, and the manner of a man who had spent 40 years being trusted with difficult truths. He placed a folder on the desk and opened it slowly, and said that Ethan's father, Robert Cole, had died 10 days earlier of cardiac failure at the age of 72. He said this with the professional gentleness of a man who has said such things many times but has not stopped meaning them. Ethan sat with this information for a moment. He had not spoken to his father in 7 years, not out of hatred, not out of grievance, but out of a choice he had made at 31 to step away from the world his father had built and try to understand who he was outside of it. Robert Cole had built Cole Dining Group from a single restaurant in Chicago 40 years ago. By the time he died, it comprised 47 properties across 11 countries, including 6 restaurants with Michelin stars, 4 hotel dining programs, a culinary academy in Paris, and a brand valuation that analysts placed in the neighborhood of $4.3 billion. Ethan was the only child. He was the sole heir. The documents in Gerald's folder confirmed this, with the quiet authority of things that have already been decided. Ethan had known this day would come. He had known it with the abstract foreknowledge of someone who understands the logic of a situation without being fully prepared for the moment of its arrival. He had left Cole Dining Group, or rather, had left the expectation of inheriting it, not because he hated his father or disdained the business, but because he had looked at himself at 31 and seen someone who had never once done a difficult thing without a safety net, and he had found that person unacceptable. He wanted to cook because he was good at it, not because his last name opened doors. He wanted Lily to grow up in a house where value was earned, and work was real, and love was not conditioned on performance. He had taken the sous chef position at a small restaurant in a coastal town, and he had kept his name common enough that no one connected him to the empire. Cole was not an unusual surname, and Ethan had never volunteered the connection. Only Gerald knew. And now, Gerald was telling him that the board of Cole Dining Group required him, as the new principal shareholder and named executive heir, to take his seat. Not immediately, not without transition, but soon, and irrevocably, and with full knowledge of everything his father had built. Gerald slid one more document across the table, a personal letter, handwritten, in his father's narrow cursive. Ethan picked it up and read it, and then set it down without speaking. He looked out the window at the city for a long moment. Then he said he needed a few days. Gerald said, "Of course." On the flight back to Harborview, 30,000 feet above the seam between sky and water, Ethan thought about his mother, who had died when he was 19, and whose voice he could still hear sometimes when the kitchen was quiet, and the night was late, and the work was going well. Character matters more than wealth. She had said it often enough that it had become structural, built into the load-bearing walls of who he was. He pressed his forehead briefly against the cold airplane window, and watched the coastline appear below like something remembered from a dream. He came back to Harborview on a Thursday, and he went straight to Blue Harbor, and put on his apron and worked the dinner service. He did not tell anyone where he had been. He did not tell anyone what he now knew. He made a saffron bouillabaisse that evening that Pete called the best thing he had ever eaten. And Pete was not a man who gave compliments without first giving them serious consideration. Life, for a few weeks, continued in its familiar shape: Lily's school, the morning walk, the evening kitchen, the sound of the ocean at closing time. But things were shifting in the background, in ways that the town of Harborview could feel without yet being able to name. Black sedans began appearing occasionally on the main street, idling for a few minutes and then gone. Men in good suits were seen entering Blue Harbor between lunch and dinner, sitting with Ethan at the corner table, speaking in low voices over cups of coffee. Ethan received 3 phone calls a day from numbers he answered quietly, stepping outside while Marcus watched the stove. He hired a new line cook without explanation. He had the restaurant's plumbing repaired, and the exterior repainted improvements he paid for in cash without discussion, which surprised the contractor, who had expected a negotiation. One afternoon he sat down with Pete and Marcus and Jenny, and told them that he was buying Blue Harbor from its owner, who had been looking to sell for 2 years. He told them nothing would change. He told them their wages were going up effective immediately, by 30%, for all 3. There was a silence at the table that had the texture of something trying to decide what shape it wanted to take. Jenny said, "Why?" And Ethan said, "Because you deserve it, and I can." Pete looked at the table. Marcus looked at his hands. Nobody asked where the money came from, because sometimes people sense that an answer would rearrange too many things at once, and they choose, wisely, to let the rearrangement happen at its own pace. Meanwhile, in a different version of Harborview, a version full of gleaming interiors and private dinners, and the particular social choreography of people who have too much time and money, and use them both to perform for each other, Vanessa had found her place beside Adrian Sterling. She had attended the yacht dinner. She had attended the gallery opening. She had appeared in photographs at 2 charity events, standing beside Adrian with the careful posture of someone who is aware of being looked at and has decided to meet that gaze directly. It looked, from the outside, like exactly what she had wanted. The apartment Adrian kept in the city was 4 times the size of anything she had lived in. He had a regular table at 3 restaurants, and at all 3, the staff addressed him by name and brought things unprompted. He bought her a coat that cost more than she made in a month, and watched her wear it with the quiet satisfaction of a collector who has acquired a piece he admires. But there was something in the admiring that Vanessa had not anticipated. It was the quality of his attention. It was wide and bright, and it landed on her the same way it landed on the coat, on the apartment, on the arrangement of flowers on his dining table. She was, in the economy of Adrian's life, a pleasant acquisition. When she spoke about her work, his eyes stayed engaged for exactly as long as politeness required, and then drifted to the room. When she laughed at something unexpected, something real, he smiled the way people smile at a sound they haven't quite caught but have decided to respond to anyway. At a dinner party one evening, marble table, 12 guests, a sommelier who moved around the room like weather, she made a small joke about something she'd read that morning and got a laugh from the couple across from her, and she turned instinctively to share the moment with someone who would find it as funny as she had, and Adrian was already deep in conversation about land valuations with the man to his left. She held her wine glass and looked at the candle flame and thought of Ethan, not his face first, not his hands, but his attention. The way he had of being entirely present in a conversation. The way he remembered things she had mentioned weeks later and brought them back without fanfare. The way he laughed from somewhere real. She pushed the thought away. She reached for the bread. The announcement appeared first on a regional business news site on a Tuesday morning in late January, and then, within hours, everywhere else. Cole Dining Group, the international culinary conglomerate with a portfolio spanning 3 continents and 6 Michelin stars, had announced its new CEO and principal owner, effective 30 days prior. The name was Ethan Cole, 42 years old, currently residing in Harborview. The accompanying photograph showed him in a charcoal suit against a white background, looking directly at the camera with the same expression he used in the kitchen when things were going exactly as they should: calm, complete, requiring nothing from the room. A secondary article, published by a financial outlet within the hour, ran the headline, "The Humble Billionaire. How a Small-Town Chef Quietly Inherited a Culinary Empire." The story included interviews with former colleagues who had known him only as a cook, a former neighbor who remembered him fixing his daughter's bicycle on the front step, a food critic who had eaten at Blue Harbor twice and called the food inexplicably extraordinary for its context, and now, reading the article, understood why. By noon, the story had spread far enough to reach the boutique hotel 2 blocks from the waterfront, where a woman named Vanessa stood in the back office and read it on her phone with her hand pressed flat against her sternum as though checking whether her heart was still moving. She read it 3 times. She put the phone down. She picked it up and read it again. Outside the office window, the winter harbor was gray and quiet, and the boats rocked gently at their moorings. And everything looked exactly as it always had, and nothing felt the same. Adrian Sterling saw the article at roughly the same time, in his car, on the way to a meeting. He read the name and the details, and he sat with this information in the particular way of a man who has prided himself on knowing people before they become important, and who has now discovered that the quiet cook in the restaurant he patronized for 3 years, the man whose food he had praised on index cards, whose girlfriend he had lured away with flowers and jewelry, was worth approximately 40 times more than he was. His assistant, sitting in the front seat, tactfully did not look back. Adrian placed the phone face down on his knee and stared out the window and said nothing for the rest of the drive. The Harborview staff received the news with the stunned silence of people who have been given information that is simultaneously obvious and impossible. Pete stood at the sink with water running over his hands and stared at the wall. Marcus called his wife. Jenny sat down on a kitchen stool and said, "I always thought something was different about the stock," and then laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. The whole town shifted slightly on its axis, not because money had arrived, but because the story it told was a particular kind of story, the kind that confirms something people want to believe about the world, that dignity can exist quietly, that goodness doesn't always announce itself, that the man who fixes the broken toy and wakes up early and makes the soup without complaint might be carrying something extraordinary, and that the extraordinary and the ordinary are not, in the end, opposites. The grand opening of Coles Harbor, the new flagship restaurant on Harborview's waterfront, financed and designed under Ethan's direct oversight, was set for a Friday evening in March, when the days were beginning to lengthen and the light off the water had started to carry some warmth. The space was extraordinary. Floor to ceiling glass along the seaward wall, a kitchen open to the dining room behind a pass of polished steel, tables set in dark linen with flowers that cost more per arrangement than Blue Harbor's daily revenue had once been. The guest list was regional royalty industry figures, collectors, journalists from the city, a few names known nationally in the food world. A publicist had been hired, reluctantly, because Ethan's lawyer had insisted. A photographer from a national food magazine was positioned near the entrance. The town's residents lined the street outside with the cheerful, wondering attention of people attending a parade that has come to their own street for the first time. Ethan arrived at 6:15, 15 minutes after the doors opened. A detail that was either accidental or a statement, and that was interpreted, by those who watched it, as deliberate. He wore a black suit with a white shirt open at the collar. He wore it the way he wore his apron, as a thing that was on him, not a thing he was performing. He walked through the front door holding Lily's hand, and she was in a cream dress with a sash of deep blue. And she looked up at the lights and the room with the wide, uncomplicated delight of a child who has not yet learned to pretend not to be impressed. Someone called his name and he turned. A flashbulb fired. He bent down briefly to straighten the hem of Lily's dress. In the light, and cameras caught this image too. The man in the $10,000 suit, kneeling on the floor of his own restaurant to fix his daughter's hem, and it was this image, more than any other, that circulated most widely in the days that followed, and that people kept returning to with the recognition of having seen something that told the truth. Vanessa was in the crowd on the street. She had not been on the guest list, she had known she would not be, but she had come anyway, drawn by something she could not have named precisely, something in the territory between accountability and grief. She stood near the edge of the gathering in a coat she had bought with her own money, not Adrian's, and she watched Ethan walk into the building through the glass doors, and she felt the full weight of what she had done in a way that is only possible when you can see clearly, without the distortion of want or habit, exactly what you had and exactly what it was worth. The weeks since the announcement had not been kind to her. Adrian had become more distant as the news about Ethan spread, not out of jealousy. She understood now, but because Adrian related to people through the currency of social utility, and the calculus around her had changed in ways that didn't favor the investment. He was courteous. He was not warm. One evening at dinner he had checked his watch twice in the first 15 minutes, and she had understood, without the need for words, that she had arrived at the end of something. She had moved back to her own apartment. She had sat in it for several evenings, simply being still, not checking anything, not going anywhere, listening to the sounds of the building, and the street, and the life she had traded away, a perfectly good thing to arrive at. She requested, through a mutual contact, a brief meeting with Ethan at the opening. She was given 5 minutes, in the side room off the main dining space, while the party moved along without them. She stood across from him in that room and she looked at his face, the same face, she realized, completely unchanged, from the one that had watched her pick up her bag in his small apartment on a rainy night in November, and she found that the speech she had prepared did not arrive in the order she had planned. She said she was sorry. She said she had been wrong to measure him against the wrong things. She said she had confused the size of a life with the value of it. And she had been the smaller person in the relationship they'd shared. Not him. Her voice broke once, briefly, and she steadied it. Ethan listened to all of this with his hands still at his sides and his face composed. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Not the punishing kind of quiet, not the theatrical kind, just the pause of a man who has thought about something long enough to know what he actually believes. He said, "You didn't leave because I was poor. You left because you stopped seeing who I was." He said it without accusation, as a statement of record. Then he said, and this was the part she had not expected, that he was grateful to her, that the night she left, sitting alone in his kitchen listening to the rain, he had understood with a clarity he might not otherwise have found what he was actually building and for whom. He had understood that the life he had chosen, the quiet life, the apron, the morning walk, the homemade birthday cake, was not a consolation. It was the point. She had asked him once, early in their relationship, whether he ever wished for more, and he had said no. And she had thought he meant he lacked ambition, and what he had actually meant was that he already had the things that mattered, and that more was not a direction that interested him. He thanked her, and he meant it. And this was the cruelest and the kindest thing he could have done, because it left her with nothing to argue against. She nodded. She said something she couldn't quite hold the shape of afterward. She walked back out into the party and stood near the edge of the room and watched Ethan rejoin his guests, watched him shake hands and accept congratulations, and bend down to show Lily something interesting about the kitchen visible through the open pass. Adrian was in the room too, she realized. He was standing near the bar with a glass of something and the look of a man who has arrived at a party that is not about him and is deciding whether to acknowledge this. He and Ethan exchanged a brief nod, the nod of two men who understand each other's positions completely and have nothing in particular to prove. Then Adrian said something to the woman beside him and turned away. And that was the last time any significant version of his story intersected with Ethan's. A journalist named Caroline Marsh, who covered the intersection of food and culture for a magazine read by 300,000 people monthly, had been watching Ethan for the better part of an hour before she introduced herself. She was 41, direct in the way of people who have spent 20 years asking questions for a living, and have learned that circumspection wastes everyone's time. She had covered the story of Cole Dining Group's succession when it broke, and she had found it interesting in the standard way billionaire heir lives as common man, reveals fortune, etc. But watching Ethan in this room, seeing the specific way he moved through it, not with the performance of humility, not with the self-consciousness of someone who has recently been made important, but simply as himself, which was the only mode he appeared to have, she had begun to feel that the story was more interesting than its surface. She came over and introduced herself, and he shook her hand and said he'd read her piece on the Basque food movement the previous year, and thought it was the most honest thing he'd read about culinary identity in some time. She said thank you, and meant it. She said she'd like to interview him, not about the business, she had colleagues better placed for that, but about the other thing, the choice. He looked at her for a moment, with the considering look he had, and then he said yes, and that was how it began. The interview ran 3 months later, in June, and it was the one that people kept going back to, not because it revealed anything shocking, but because it said something true. When Caroline asked him why he had kept his wealth hidden for so many years, he said, "Because I wanted my daughter to know love before luxury. I wanted her to understand that the most important things a person can offer are their attention and their work. If she had grown up knowing we had billions, the lesson would have been distorted. I couldn't let that happen. When she asked whether he regretted the years of comparative difficulty, the small apartment, the line cook wages, the used truck, he said, "I don't think of them as difficult. I think of them as real." When she pressed him on the subject of Lily, whether he worried about her future in the context of vast wealth, he thought for a long time and then said, "She already knows the most important things. She knows how to be kind to people who are working hard. She knows that making something with your hands for someone you love is worth more than buying it. She'll be fine." The article was accompanied by a photograph taken by Caroline's colleague on the beach below the Coles Harbor restaurant on a Sunday morning. Ethan and Lily, barefoot in the sand, the water behind them, both of them looking at something just outside the frame, her hand in his. No restaurant empire context. No vest, no suit, just a father and a daughter. The caption read only their names. It was reported, some weeks after the opening, that Ethan had endowed a culinary training program for young people from low-income households, a 12-month apprenticeship that combined formal instruction with real kitchen experience and placed graduates in restaurant positions with Cole Dining Group's domestic properties. The first cohort was 23 students. The program was named for his mother, Margaret Cole, who had cooked for a church soup kitchen every Saturday morning for 30 years, and who had believed, with total conviction, that feeding people was one of the most direct and honest forms of love. Ethan had made the announcement without a press conference, without a publicist, without any of the apparatus of managed generosity. A local education reporter had found out through a school administrator and written a brief item about it, and that item had been shared widely enough that people began to understand the pattern, the scholarship fund for local children that had been running anonymously for 4 years, the regular cash donations to the community food pantry that the pantry's director had traced back to a numbered account, and then, quietly, to Ethan, the fact that every member of Blue Harbor's original staff had, upon the restaurant's acquisition, received not just the pay raise, but a small equity stake in the new entity. These discoveries arrived in sequence, each one adding a line to a portrait that was already complete in its essential character but kept revealing new details, the way a painting acquires depth when you step closer and see what the brushwork contains. Vanessa left Harborview in April. She did not make an announcement of this. She packed her things over a weekend, returned her key to the boutique hotel, and drove north on a gray morning with the windows up and the radio off. She had a sister in Portland who had offered her the spare room, and she took it. She got a job at a small event planning company different from the hotel work but adjacent to it, familiar enough to be navigable. She began, slowly and without drama, to rebuild a life around a different set of values, or rather, around the values she had always had but had been crowded out by want. She called her mother more often. She cooked meals at home and found, to her own surprise, that she was not without skill in the kitchen. She ate alone at a small restaurant near her sister's house one evening in May and ordered the seafood chowder from the menu. And when it arrived, the broth deep and slightly sweet with cream, the clams tender, the warmth of it settling into her chest, she sat with the bowl, and the memory arrived without warning. The small kitchen in Harborview, the cast-iron pot, Ethan's back to her as he stirred, Lily asleep on the chair in the corner with her crayon drawing. She didn't cry. She just sat with it, let it be what it was, which was the memory of something real and good that she had not known how to keep. Then she finished her soup and paid her bill, and walked home in the cool spring evening, and thought about what she wanted the next year to look like. Summer returned to Harborview with its usual extravagance, the light lasting past 9. The harbor full, the smell of salt and sunscreen, and grilled fish from the restaurants along the waterfront. Coles Harbor was fully booked through September. The food press had been enthusiastic in the particular way that food press becomes enthusiastic when a story has both culinary merit and narrative appeal. Lily was on summer vacation and spent her mornings at the beach and her afternoons sometimes in the kitchen of Coles Harbor, where the pastry chef, a woman named Dominique, who had been recruited from Lyon and who had a genius for anything involving chocolate, had appointed her an unofficial apprentice and taught her to make toules and madeleines, and, one memorable afternoon, a perfect pâte à choux. Lily took to it with the focused pleasure of a child who has discovered that some skills are worth the difficulty. And she brought home things she had made, and set them on the kitchen table and waited, with barely contained excitement, for Ethan to taste them. He always tasted them with full attention, no distractions, no phone, just the thing in his hand and his honest opinion, given carefully, and with the warmth of a man who understands that encouragement and honesty are not opposites. One Sunday evening in late August, Ethan closed Coles Harbor early, a rare thing, noticed by the staff, not questioned. He drove to the spot on the beach below the restaurant, where the sand was widest and the rocks made a natural windbreak, and he spread out a blanket and unpacked the small basket he had prepared in the kitchen that afternoon: cold lobster salad, sourdough bread, a wedge of aged cheddar, sliced peaches from the farmer's market, 2 glasses, and a bottle of sparkling water for Lily. She arrived in her swim things, still sandy from the afternoon, and sat cross-legged on the blanket, and looked at the food with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who considers herself a person of discernment. The sun was going down over the water in the way it does in late summer. Slowly and with full commitment to the spectacle, the sky going amber and then deep orange, and then, at the horizon, a thin line of rose that faded into blue above it. They ate without hurrying. Lily told him about a book she was reading, something about a girl who could talk to sea creatures, and he listened and asked questions, and she answered them and added things she hadn't planned to say, the way children do when they know they have your complete attention. The harbor below them caught the last of the light and held it briefly on its surface like something cradled. Ethan watched his daughter eat a piece of bread with the concentrated pleasure of someone who is not yet old enough to eat without fully inhabiting the experience. And something settled in him, not a new feeling, not a discovery, but a confirmation. He had been right about all of it. The choice, the years, the apron, the small apartment, the morning walks, all of it had been for this. This child, this light, this ordinary, extraordinary evening. He was, by any external measure, one of the most powerful figures in his industry. He controlled a portfolio valued in the billions. His name was in publications that had never heard of Harborview before this year. And sitting here on a blanket on a beach with a bottle of sparkling water and a wedge of cheese, he was richer than he had ever been in his life. Lily looked up from her bread and found him watching her. And she said with the casual accuracy of children, who often say the important things without knowing they are important, "Daddy, are we finally happy now?" He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He looked at the water, and the fading light, and his daughter's sand-covered feet, and the peach slices in the bowl between them. He said, "We were always happy, sweetheart." She considered this with the evaluating expression she used when she suspected an adult of being technically correct, but missing the point. She said, "I mean, like, really happy." He smiled, the full version, the one that changed his whole face. He said, "Yeah, really happy." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her bread. The sun finished its descent. The line of rose at the horizon faded. The first stars appeared above the water, faint and patient, the way they always are at the beginning of night, before the dark is complete enough to show how many there are. Some people spend their entire lives chasing a version of wealth that lives just beyond what they have: the next salary, the next address, the next person who looks good on their arm. They run toward it with everything they've got, and the thing they're running toward keeps moving, and eventually, they are very tired, and very far from where they started, and no closer to the feeling they were after. And some people, a few, figure out early or late or somewhere in the middle that the feeling was never going to be found in the direction they were looking. That it was already in the house they left that morning, in the hand they were already holding, in the smell of something cooking, and the sound of a child's breathing in the next room. Ethan Cole had known this. He had built his whole quiet life around this knowledge, in a small coastal town, in a plain apron, in a used truck that needed new brakes. He had known it when he chose the small apartment over the family estate. He had known it when he made the birthday cake by hand instead of ordering one. He had known it when he sat in the dark after the door closed and did not chase after what had left. Because what mattered was still there, asleep down the hall, and the morning was coming, and the morning would want pancakes cut like stars. The fortune was real. The restaurants were real. The suit and the board meetings and the name on the building all real. But the richest thing Ethan Cole possessed could not be appraised or transferred or displayed in a photograph on a news site. It was the knowledge that he had never confused what was important for what was impressive. It was a 7-year-old girl who believed her father made the best food in the world. It was the fact that she was not wrong.